Super. Okay, so well, thanks, Alexa, and welcome everybody to MEOPAR's annual training meeting, and actually perhaps to MEOPAR for the first time. As many of you know, though, MEOPAR is a network of centers of excellence. We've been around for almost a decade now, and we plan to be around for longer. I'm just going to give a little introduction and about what we're about, and that'll take a few minutes, and then we're launching into the business. So let's just, I'm going to get the presentation set up and then share my screen. If I can find it, yeah, there. Can you see that? Hopefully you can.
Yes, Doug.
Okay, so MEOPAR stands for Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's really about helping Canadians to establish a coordinated Canadian approach to dealing with our vast amount of ocean real estate that we've got. Like any organization, we have a vision and challenges. Our vision is to inspire and enable Canadian leadership in marine environmental observation, prediction, and response in close coordination with partners, and to deliver knowledge, technology, technique, and highly qualified personnel to do what? To enhance resilience and to optimize economic opportunity for Canada. And the challenge is to effectively develop, but also mobilize Canada's scientific capacity to both anticipate ocean change and to guide effective response in order that we'll minimize risk and maximize opportunity. So we're in our second funding cycle. We do a lot of work on partnering in research, but also training in order to strengthen this anticipation and response to marine risk. And here's just an example of what do we mean by what types of risk and what types of hazards are we dealing with. Our research program is organized according to two themes. First one is environmental change, and that one relates to weather-related risk or increasingly climate change-related risk or oceanification and things like that. And the second one relates to risk associated with just the fact that there's an awful lot of human beings around and we're doing a lot of different things. And the risk is, what's the risk to? It's to what we call areas of vulnerability. That includes coastal communities. It includes the marine ecosystem and the living resources of the ocean, and it includes also to industries and economic activity occurring along our coast. And we separate it according to this way, but really increasingly, the pressures and the sources of risk are coupled. They intersect. And I'm going to give you a quick example of that just from the last few days, actually. And so this relates to what happened out in Victoria and off the west coast of Vancouver Island in the literally last few days. Probably most of you have heard about this, the accident involving a large container vessel, the Zim Kingston. And this really provides a classic example of a modern complex maritime accident. First was started with one extreme storm, which caused this large container vessel to suffer some damage, and they lost 40 shipping containers overboard and caused damage to others. And that incident took place off the west coast of Vancouver Island, and those 40 containers are either sunk or they're floating, and they're sort of need to be tracked. And then the ship moved to Victoria, to the harbor, or anchored off Victoria. And part of the problem here was the ship was carrying a large amount of potassium amyl xanthate. And if you read the MSDS for that chemical, when it's exposed to moisture, you can have spontaneous combustion, and when the compound, the solid, decomposes at high temperatures, you can form toxic gases. And not surprisingly, perhaps, that happened, as you have probably mainly seen. And then to compound things, the response had to be done very quickly because another storm was approaching and probably hitting the Vancouver Island right now as we speak. So this is an example of an accident. What science involved? Well, meteorology and forecasting. It relates to ship routing and planning. Then the containers themselves, when the 40 containers have to be tracked, physical modeling is required to help track them. Then there's a chemistry of hazardous materials, but then when the ship is in the harbor and on fire, toxic gases are being emitted, for example, carbon bisulfide probably, and then you need atmospheric chemistry and emissions monitoring, you need meteorology and forecasting to predict where those gases might go and how quickly and how far. Obviously, there's firefighting, there's emergency response and disaster preparedness is involved here. Canadian Coast Guard did a super job. If the accident had turned out worse, and it seems to be under control right now, we would have needed physical oceanography to guide studies of ocean dispersion to see where the contaminants would have gone, marine chemistry, toxicology, and biological monitoring in case the ecosystem was impacted, obviously human health response being located so close to Victoria, and then no doubt lawyers and policymakers would get involved to lessons learned and what to do next time. But overall, you need preparedness, you need knowledge, you need teamwork, and you need coordination. And the blue bolded areas are all areas that MEOPAR is active supporting research and training in those blue areas, almost all of them. But the key thing is you have to put them all together. So this is what MEOPAR tries to do from a research and training component. We support multi-partner national research projects across the country. We support collaborative activities, including new approaches to sharing of research infrastructures and providing access to them. And we support training and support for early career scientists. Some key definitions here: coordinate. That word shows up in our vision statement. That doesn't mean lead, right? That doesn't mean lead. To me, coordinate means, or to the dictionary, I should say, it means to make many different things. And I guess people work effectively as a whole, and to bring different elements of a complex activity or organization into a relationship that will ensure efficiency or harmony. And that's what we in MEOPAR sort of have as our premise of what we're trying to do, is to bring people together, bring things and people together to be more efficient or more harmonious in approaching marine risk. And then mobilize means to organize or prepare something, such as a group of people, for a purpose. And that includes early career researchers, students, graduate students, postdocs, and so on. That's what we hoped to do. That's what we're doing a little bit of in this training meeting. We've got researchers, students, postdocs, all across the country I think at the moment, 25 or 26 different universities, as well as we work so closely with federal ministries like we're going to hear from Liisa in a moment from DFO. We work with other federal agencies as well, and a whole number of NGOs, organizations like the Canadian Ocean Literacy Coalition, research organizations like the Ocean Frontier Institute. We work with a vast number of partners, try to bring them together. I'm going to finish up now with, again, welcoming you, along with Alexa, to the annual training meeting, and also welcoming you, in a way, to the UN Decade, which we're going to hear about next from Liisa and from the panelists. To me, the UN Decade is really future-oriented. Its mantra seems to be to deliver the science we need for the ocean we want, and that really implies sort of a future-oriented activity. And there's no question that Canada has an awful lot to offer and a lot of people to offer for this global activity. But the question is, again, in a country as diverse and complex and just big as Canada, how do we do that best? How do we mobilize ourselves effectively? And then, to me, it's a decade. It's an entire decade long, and we're just getting started. To me, again, it makes sense to build on people and on careers that are just starting out. So I think it's particularly opportune to have this session at the beginning of the ATM in order that the next generation of ocean researchers, professionals, experts can get involved from an early stage. And I guess now, Alexa, I hand over to Liisa. I'm really looking forward to seeing what she has to say, and looking forward to the rest of the ATM. I'm going to finish there.
Thank you so much, Doug, for really setting the stage for our conversation today and explaining really, the nuts and bolts of MEOPAR. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Liisa Peramaki. Liisa is the director of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. She leads an enthusiastic and dedicated team who is working with the, excuse me, with the, with the international science community to advance Canada's contribution to the ocean decade. Since joining DFO in 2002, Lisa's been responsible for a variety of programs within the ecosystems and ocean science sector, including marine conservation, habitat science, environmental response, and international biodiversity and science. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Liisa. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Alexa and Doug, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin in Ottawa. I have a short presentation today to talk about the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So Doug indicated that MEOPAR is a mouthful, so is this one. We refer to it as the Ocean Decade. I'll talk a little bit about what that is. It sounds like some of you are already well aware, already well engaged, and others are keen to learn a little bit more. So I'll talk a little bit about that, what the Government of Canada is doing, or Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and then finally how you can get involved. Next slide, please. So what is the Ocean Decade? It's an international initiative. It's being led by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, or the IOC, and with support from member states, including Canada. It is described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for global ocean science community to get together, to generate ocean science to support sustainable development of our oceans. And the IOC has drafted an implementation plan where a vision is articulated, and Doug shared that already, the science we need for the ocean we want. The implementation plan also talks or has includes 7 ocean outcomes that describe this ocean that we want. And so you'll see them listed here, 7 of them. I won't read them out, but you see they're really aspirational. They're high level. There really is something for everyone here, depending on what your interest is, what your area of expertise is. And these outcomes, we have a lot of latitude to work within each of these outcomes. And it provides a framework for us to start thinking about how we organize ourselves and how we're going to make action under the Ocean Decade. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in the Government of Canada and in Fisheries and Oceans? The Government of Canada is a strong supporter of the Ocean Decade. Minister Jordan signed on to be a member of the Ocean Decade Alliance, and this is a group of eminent partners that will be leading by example to catalyze action under the Ocean Decade. At Fisheries and Oceans Canada, we have established a dedicated Ocean Decade office within the science sector of DFO, and that's where I'm situated. My staff and I work in this Ocean Decade office. Over the last year, we've been participating in a number of global activities. We've co-hosted a series of workshops on gender in the Ocean Decade and talking about the important role that women have to play in ocean science. We've also provided support for a virtual session for early career ocean professionals, or ECOPs. And then at home, we have launched the Ocean Decade within Canada. This was through 2 important events in 2021. One of them was the kickoff launch workshop in March, and then that was followed up by another workshop in May. And some of you may have attended one or both of those workshops. The idea of these workshops was to start to engage with the Canadian ocean science community, to talk about what the decade is, and to start to talk about what some Canadian priorities are and where there are some unique areas for Canada to make some contributions. Within DFO, we also hosted a call for proposals to external partners soliciting projects under the Ocean Decade. That's a process that's ongoing, and we're hoping to be able to make some agreements later on this winter. We've also been participating in Ocean Decade Laboratories, and we're turning to look at the governance. This is like, how do we organize ourselves? How to strengthen that engagement, ensure that we're reaching out? How can we work collectively with all of the sectors to be able to really leverage the contributions from others, the collective resources, and to maximize the impact of ocean science? So we've established a DFO Science Committee, Government of Canada Committee, and we're exploring the options for how best to engage with the broader ocean science community. Next slide, please. So how can you get involved? The Ocean Decade really is for everyone. Anyone can join, anyone can participate. I alluded to these Ocean Decade Laboratories previously. This is a great place to learn a little bit more about the Ocean Decade. They're creative, virtual platforms that support action under specific outcomes. The next one that's being hosted is on a clean ocean in November. You can find information about those Ocean Decade Laboratories on the IOC website. Another way to get involved is to contribute in these calls for decade actions. So the IOC just launched a call for actions about 2 weeks ago now. They're looking for programs that support 3 priority areas: marine pollution, multiple stressors, and the ocean climate nexus. So that's a great way to get involved. We're working within our department and other government departments to find out what Government of Canada programs could be solicited, but also starting to reach out to the broader community to find out some ideas and plans for the broader ocean science community. Another way to get involved is to join the ECOPs chapter, and I think Neha is going to be talking about that. I also wanted to mention to you that you could attend the 4th ICES Pisces Early Career Scientists Conference. DFO is hosting that in St. John's in May. That's another great way to get involved. There's going to be the conference really does have the theme of the Ocean Decade. It's a great way to network, to find out more, to partner up, start some collaboration. Then I also welcome you to sign up for our email distribution to find out a little bit more about some of the things that we're doing. And if we can have the next slide, it shows our website. I encourage you to check out our website. We're always trying to add more content to that, videos and other events. So we'll be listing IOC events as well as events that we'll be organizing ourselves. Please reach out to me, anybody on my team. We're just really keen to hear ideas and to have some discussions about how we can all work together under the Ocean Decade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liisa, for giving us a robust overview of the nuts and bolts of what the UN Decade is, and most importantly, how we can get involved. I'm wondering if you're able to put a link in the chat to where folks can sign up for that email newsletter list. I received one over the weekend and it was very informative. I'm sure many folks would love to be on that. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Jennifer Jackson. Dr. Jennifer Jackson is a physical oceanographer who studies currents, waves, tides, and how the atmosphere interacts with the ocean and how the physical environment affects marine animals and plants. Over her career, she has studied the Arctic, Indian, and Pacific Ocean. Jennifer currently works as a research assistant at the Haekai Institute, a not-for-profit organization that's actively studying the coastal margins of British Columbia. Jennifer sits on several national and international committees. In her free time, she hangs out with her kids and animals and works on the British Columbia Environmental Film Fest, which she has recently co-founded. All right, Jennifer, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm sitting here today from the traditional territory of the Kwangwin and Wasanich people, and I can confirm there is a big storm going on, so I am very thankful to have power right now, and hopefully it will only be for a few more hours. It's really great to be here, and first of all, I just want to acknowledge all of the different umbrellas that I'm sitting under for this Ocean Decade, and for this talk, very brief talk, I'll go through some of those. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's four main things that I'm working on for the Ocean Decade. The first is a joint ICES Pisces program called SmartNets, and that was established this year as one of the decade programs. It's to increase knowledge exchange by expanding and strengthening collaboration of ICES Pisces and the partner organizations. It focuses on gender equity, ECOP, Indigenous communities, and developing nations. The second organization is CEUS, which is a Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System. And this is an organization that is co-founded by MEOPAR, by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and also by the Haekai Institute. It was established in 2018, and it's really brought the oceanographic community together to manage oceanographic data. It has led to more transparent and accessible ocean data, which is really exciting and one of the main goals for the Ocean Decade. And it's anticipated that CEUS will play a large role in the ocean data management. And then as Alexa mentioned, I have co-founded a film festival. This is really a side project for me, and it's more of a passion project, but the idea is to bring filmmakers and scientists together to enhance communication of scientific information. And we have our first film festival in December. It will be an online festival, and you can go to that link to find out more information. And then finally, the Tula Foundation, which is the foundation that funds the Haekai Institute, has a lot of different initiatives for the Ocean Decade, and I'll go through those in the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, together with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and MEOPAR, the Tula Foundation is a funder of CEUS. So that's one of the main things that they're doing for the Ocean Decade. But also they have proposed a regional decade collaborative center for the Northeast Pacific. And there's a new website coming out. I've put the link there, oceandecadenortheastpacific.org. And there will be a lot more information in the coming weeks about this, this initiative. The regional DCC, it's intended to support the implementation of the UN Decade in the region. And these are some of the things that they're hoping to do. So amplify and support the UN Decade programs and projects in the region, catalyze new projects, support capacity building and training, and foster ocean literacy and engagement. And several UN Ocean Decade endorsed programs and projects exist in this region. And so the idea is to start bringing a lot of those initiatives together. In addition, there is a new person that's in charge for the Tula of the Ocean Decade. Her name is Rebecca Martone. Many of you may know her already. And there's her email address there. And last slide, please. In addition, for the Haekai Institute, so again, the Haekai Institute is funded by the Tula Foundation, and there's lots of different programs that Haekai is involved in that have already been endorsed by the UN Decade. So first of all, there's Marine Life 2030, there's the Ocean Acidification Observing Network, or GOON, the Ocean Biomolecular Network, or OBON, SmartNet, which I mentioned, the Ocean Observing Co-Design, Evolving Ocean Observing for a Sustainable Future. So that's linked to GOOSE, MAP, and BECI. And that's it.
Sorry about that. I was stuck on mute. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's really interesting to see all the different hats you wear and how they have common themes and how they all intersect. I just want to remind folks that if you have any questions for the panelists as they're delivering their lightning presentations, feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat so that folks can respond in real time. I'll now pass it over to Fanny. Fanny is a professor of biological oceanography at the Institut de Sciences de la Mer from the Université de Québec à Rimouski. Her research focuses on the functioning of marine coastal ecosystems in the context of environmental changes, with a particular interest in seaweeds and seagrasses. As the leader of the UNESCO Chair in Integrated Analysis of Marine System, she promotes interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, multiple ways of knowing research to address sustainability in coastal oceans. All right, Fanny, over to you. Fanny, we can't hear you. I think you are on mute. Okay, I think Fanny's internet might be frozen, so I'm going to pass it over to Paul. We'll have Paul's lightning presentation, and then we'll come back to Fanny. Paul is a physical oceanographer and a professor and associate dean research science at the University of Alberta. His research focuses on the role of freshwater in the ocean, as well as understanding the linkages between Arctic and North Atlantic oceans. Paul is the lead of the prediction core at MEOPAR, as well as the Canadian NEMO Ocean Modeling Forum. He was also elected a Fellow of the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society in 2021. Paul, over to you.
Unmute first. Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please? So when I was given this task of sort of thinking about for the UN Decade of Ocean Science Sustainable Development and sort of my role in it and what discussions in it, I sort of wanted to keep this fairly high level. So introducing myself, I'm a physical oceanographer and mainly numerical modeler from the University of Alberta. But what's also relevant is that I'm the Canadian National Chair for SCORE, the Scientific Committee on Oceanic Research, and I'm actually a member of the International SCORE Executive, the Executive Secretary. And that brings in sort of a lot of coordination activities and how to get Canadian researchers and academics involved in UN Decade programs. And as has been nicely introduced before, the UN Decade is broad and involves everyone who wants to be involved in the UN Decade can be involved, and that's fantastic. Because there's so many different areas, I want to sort of limit my involvement more in the academic coordinator. How do we get Canadian academics knowing about and involved in international activities, and even more, how do we get Canadians leading international activities, given all the world-class researchers in Canada, all the ocean research going on, how the ocean is so important for Canada. So that's why I'm involved in UN Decade planning, because I think it's important for our country as a whole. We depend on the oceans in so many ways. It's important for so many Canadians. And then that importance for Canadians means that this UN Decade is very relevant for the Canadian ocean research community, both for developing our own programs, enhancing literacy and interacting with rest Canadians, and also interacting with researchers, academics, people doing UN Decade activities around the world, because large-scale ocean research is not something that you can easily do in one tiny group. You really want to integrate lots of groups, see how things work around the world ocean, and share ideas, share approaches, training opportunities, everything. And this is also, I'd say, Canada as a major country, a G7 country, should be helping other countries throughout the world, supporting that research, things we can do for helping in other places of the world, for again strengthening a unified study of the science of the oceans, why it's important. So given that, I really want to play in my role of SCORE and see and SCORE about communication and coordination. And maybe I should have added a slide about SCORE, because I don't think everyone's necessarily familiar about SCORE, the Scientific Committee on Ocean Research, but it's really an international science body who's there to address global and multidisciplinary ocean issues, planning, conduct research, working groups and projects on topics of importance, solve methodological conceptual programs. It's also got that role, as I tried to bring up earlier, building capacity in developing countries, linking visiting scholars, fellowships, and travel support for people around the world, promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in the ocean sciences, and also, I think, has been brought up and will be brought up even more with one of our following speakers, encourage and support the development of students and early career scientists, especially given that, the Ocean Decade is a decade. The people who are early in their career now are going to be hopefully the leading scientists towards the end of the decade. So it'd be really good to bring people involved, get people learning, and slowly taking more and more a role as they advance through their careers. So I'm really, I'd say here, want to focus on communication and coordination. And the other thing if I put on my hat as the chair of the Canadian National Committee for SCORE, we're here to help Canadian researchers learn about, become involved in UN Decade activities. We don't want to suggest top-down control of what should be the projects, who should do it, any, study on any ocean basin, even though it's not next to Canada, any approach, observations, modeling, theory, combinations, any level of involvement is good. It's just, the Canada has so many world-class researchers, so many superb early career scientists studying the marine system. And I think we haven't communicated well enough what are some of the activities and possibilities associated with the UN decade. And thus we need to improve that to get Canadians more involved and hopefully in some areas even leadership positions. So I'll wrap up with that statement.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think you've a very great point in that, our early career professionals are going to be the ones really carrying this wave, and that all approaches and all aspects should be considered. I'm really looking forward to discussing more about this later on. I'm going to circle back to Fanny now. I think there was a little bit of a Wi-Fi glitch to be expected in this digital era. Without further ado, Fanny, over to you.
Thank you, Alexa, and sorry for the Wi-Fi crash before. So I join you from Rimouski, traditional territory of Mi'kmaq and Wallace First Nations. And the UN decade revolves around sustainability. And I would like to start with a quick definition of sustainability. According to the UNESCO, sustainability is a development achieving a balance between society, environment, culture, and economy. And as Canada is the country with the longest coastline in the world, the culture and well-being of numerous Indigenous people and coastal communities living on these shores are tightly linked to the ocean. In the science that most of us do, which is referred as Western science, we used to work in silo. So each of us works as an expert in their field, focused on understanding environmental processes, and most of the time we exclude cultural and social dimensions. However, grounding science in culture has been recognized as a potential pathway to successful sustainable initiatives, and on top of that, they are relevant to the communities they serve. One way to integrate culture to science is to weave traditional ecological knowledge from Indigenous people with Western science. Indigenous people accumulated thousands of years of environmental knowledge on their territories that supports their sustainable government systems. Their expertise is highly valuable, and they also place sustainability as a central goal of their natural resources management. Indigenous ways of knowing were systematically excluded from Western science in the past, and now they have to be considered if we want to transform our practices to reach sustainability in the oceans. Next slide, please. In the research I lead, I have the chance to work directly with different Indigenous communities, such as 4 Cree First Nations in Eastern James Bay, and the Wallace and the Mi'kmaq people in Eastern Quebec. The land users from these nations are directly engaged with us in, for example, collecting samples, in monitoring ecosystems, in translating and transferring practices and knowledge they have been recording for decades now. And the work we do together is based on trust, respect, and an understanding of our cultural differences, our barriers, and the common goals we share. The key points you see on screen have been listed by the Ocean Group from the Canadian Commission of UNESCO, which I belong to, but there are also key points we discussed in the DFO working groups and workshops for the UN decade. There are recommendations to improve the integration of traditional knowledge and Western science. Efficiently working with Indigenous community requires to build trust and also develop early partnerships. The research has to be co-designed in a sustainable way. So it means that interactions and discussions between the communities and scientists have to pave the way all along the research project. The action led by communities have to be supported, and engaging the youth is determinant to efficiently transfer all the knowledge forms. Finally, both side trainings is needed. It means that for scientists, training is to better understand indigenous ways of living, and for communities, they can be trained in gain expertise in science tools to lead their own research projects. If you want to learn more on this topic, I would like to draw your attention on the webinar scheduled on Wednesday morning in the ATM. And the webinar will be about meaningful engagement with Northern communities in research. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny, for highlighting our session coming up on Wednesday. I think your presentation is a great precursor to what's to come later on, and also brings a very needed component into this discussion today of how we can make sure that we're incorporating multiple ways of knowing into decade actions. I'm now going to pass it over to Neha, our last panelist. Neha is an early career Canadian scientist currently pursuing graduate studies at the University of Victoria in the Pacific Northwest. Neha is a seasonal field researcher and a diver, and was the first Canadian chosen for the prestigious Rolex Scholarship of Our World Underwater Scholarship Society, which enabled a year of global underwater exploration. Her current postgraduate work integrates her passion for marine conservation with cutting-edge genomic science, where she's using carefully developed eDNA assays to monitor various ecosystems to gauge marine health. Importantly, Neha is involved in the UN Ocean Decade through the creation and facilitation of a network of ECOPs in Canada. In conjunctions with others at the Haekai Institute and the Department of Fisheries and Ocean Canada, they are bringing together ECOPs from coast to coast in Canada to increase our capacity and presence within the global program. This network is currently in its infancy, and Neha is very excited to see it grow as the decade progresses, and I'm going to pass it over to her so we can hear a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Alexa. So I am speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen, Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So as Alexa and a couple others have mentioned today, I'm speaking about the Early Career Ocean Professionals Program, which is an officially endorsed initiative under the UN Ocean Decade. But what is an ECOP? So an ECOP is a person that self-identifies as being early in their career. So kind of broad scope, 10 years or less of professional experience within any field related to the ocean. So not only employed paid positions. So this can be sort of anything like science, filmmaking, anything in the arts, any career that focuses around the ocean. The term professional is really only used in order to be inclusive of professionals from many different sectors of society. And the idea of an ECOP working group for the UN Ocean Decade was actually conceived during the first UN Ocean Decade Global Planning meeting in 2019, after identifying the lack of representation of early career attendance at the planning meetings. So it was subsequently decided that the ECOP program should be integral in every aspect of the Ocean Decade. In the early stages, oh, sorry, can you go back to the last slide? Thank you. In the early stages of the program, a call was put out to the global ECOPs to express their needs and wants in the context of the Ocean Decade. And that's what we're seeing here in this word cloud, which I think is a really great visual representation of the ECOP program vision. So forward-looking, interdisciplinary, collaborative, those are all words that really stick out to me and are really integral in this program. Next slide, please. So with that said, the mission of the Global ECOP program is to incorporate new ways of thinking into global ocean sustainability and stewardship challenges. This can be done, first of all, through the creation of meaningful networking and professional development opportunities like MEOPAR between ECOPs themselves and with local to global institutions through the framework and infrastructure being developed by the UN Ocean Decade. And secondly, and almost more importantly, we want to bring the diverse perspectives of new generations of ocean professionals to higher level tables and decision-making conversations on a global scale. Next slide, please. That brings us to what's happening in Canada. So our chapter is relatively new, just like sort of all the regional nodes that are being developed under this global program, and we're just getting off the ground. But many of our goals fit in within the global ECOP framework. So as has also been mentioned, as a nation with vast coastlines and 3 different oceans, we want to make sure that we have engagement with ECOPs working across the country. And we want to build a cohesive network of Canadian institutions that support youth and early career engagement with ocean occupations. And finally, I would like to finish by saying that we, like the global program, have a particular emphasis on the importance of achieving demographic, gender, racial, professional, and generational representation in all of our activities to ensure that everyone is engaged and has equal opportunities to generate and transfer knowledge in the context of the UN Ocean Decade. So with that, I will pass it back to Alexa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neha, for that presentation, but also for the work that you're doing and leveraging this Canadian chapter and really bringing it off the ground. I know that many folks are keen to get involved, and we're happy to help support this initiative. So it's now time for discussion and audience Q&A. So the panelists and I have prepared some questions that we'll cycle through, but if the audience has questions, we'd love to hear from you. Please use the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring it there. Some of the questions may be able to be answered via text. If it's for a specific speaker, you can include their name. Some of them will be answered live. And before we kick in, we have another poll, the second poll that I will launch now around getting involved. So if you could take a moment to indicate what aspects of the UN Decade you'd like to get involved in. So for the first discussion question, I'm going to ask Liisa to speak to what are the most urgent ocean issues that need to be addressed during the decade.
Thanks so much. I was reflecting a lot on this over the weekend, and I think that there's just so many issues that are facing the oceans and facing ocean science related to climate change and biodiversity loss, just the general decline of ocean health, and which is the whole reason that the United Nations has declared to be our decade of ocean science. And this ocean decade represents a phenomenal opportunity. Sort of the world is watching, the world is ready to do something together. So I think that the most urgent issue that's facing us is actually to take advantage of this opportunity to really unlock the promise that the decade has for all of us. We need to leverage those existing partnerships, existing projects, and build on new ones. And so that, I think, is our most pressing issue, is just to really seize this as an opportunity and to make as much progress as we can in this decade while we have everyone collectively working together.
Absolutely. Well said, Liisa. I think it's a blessing and also a challenge to be able to really bring everyone together and actually promote that action. Are there any other panelists who would like to build on what Liisa's shared? I do also see some questions in the chat for Neha. Sarah is asking how can folks get more involved with the ECOP?
Yeah, that's a great question. At this point, we're early stages, but I'll post our ECOP Canada email address, and you can contact us directly, and then we can loop you in a capacity that you'd be comfortable in contributing to the program.
Thank you, Neha. I'll also encourage panelists to check out the Q&A so that some answers can be typed to help facilitate discussion verbally as well as written. Our second discussion question that we've prepared is for Doug. How can the UN Decade benefit Canadian ocean science and Canada's ocean spaces? What's needed to realize those benefits?
Oh, my goodness. That's a good one. I mean, I think that the key is that, we do have this, I use the word ridiculous. It's not ridiculous. It's a great privilege that Canada has to have have the longest coastline in the world and really amongst the most diverse of any country in the world. That's tremendous, right? But it's an awful lot to handle, and we've got a lot going on. And so I think, we can benefit very much from sharing our research and our approach to dealing with the ocean with our international colleagues. We're all facing related challenges, and the exchange of information and the mobilization of knowledge now has to be global. It can't, even within Canada, it's not enough, it has to be global. So we can clearly benefit from the UN Decade in being involved so that we're aware of and can make the connections to developments and new ideas and great people who are being trained and coming online, let's say, in other parts of the world. What's needed is what we've been talking about: communication, coordination, and support, especially for, I would argue, especially for early career researchers to get involved early on. It is true that the more established scientists have their networks, they have access to funds, they know people already based on, in my case, decades of experience. And it took me, though, decades of moving around the world to get that experience. It's important now in the present day to accelerate that process of getting networked globally so that we can maximize the benefits during the decade. So we need structures that allow that and support for that, along the lines of what Paul was saying, I think.
Well said, Doug. I think there's also a great opportunity for, some mentorship between more senior professionals and early career professionals, and realizing the benefits in having, varying levels of experience, varying backgrounds. Those are all so key in really holistic and effective solutions. Are there any other panelists who would like to speak to that second question?
I would love to just add that is definitely one of the goals of the ECOP program, is to connect early career researchers with senior researchers in similar fields. So sort of to create those bridges.
I think that will be incredibly beneficial.
Could I just add?
Absolutely.
As Neha was making that comment, I completely agree. But, you said, getting people in similar fields. But part of me also says, as things are changing and moving forward, people have brought in there's many ways of knowledge. There's the indigenous, there's traditional Western science, there's social science now linking to physical science policy. I think we all got to potentially give people opportunities to interact beyond their discipline in a broader area as well. Obviously you can go too broad, people, how to balance that obviously will be a challenging question, but I think we just don't want to have physical oceanographers talking with physical, biological with biological. We definitely need breadth, and those discussions generally add lots of ideas, and the synergies generally end up producing more than the total. So I just wanted to agree and push that statement even farther.
The interdisciplinary nature of, where we're at as well might also recall and require us to be engaging with science communicators, working with folks who have experience in marketing and outreach, so that as scientists, we can leverage the work that we're doing in ways that are digestible to the public and policymakers, so that we can see our research turn into solutions, into action. The next question I'm going to direct to Fanny is, how can Indigenous communities be involved in advancing the UN Decade Goals? A lot of the conversation today has really been around, engaging academics, engaging scientists, which has traditionally excluded Indigenous communities, which is definitely a narrative that must be changed. Fanny, how do you propose that we can tackle this?
I think the first thing is to have representative of Indigenous communities sitting on the boards of important committees involved in the UN Decade, which is the case, for example, in the DFO workshop for the UN Decade. There are a lot of Indigenous people representative involved, which is, I mean, to me, the first important step, because they can speak up and raise also their concern, and also teach us the barriers they face, what they live, and it's really important to understand if we want to move forward all together. So this would be the first step. From a scientific, more, let's say, Western scientific perspective, I think it's important that the scientists work with the communities to engage them, but also to listen to them, to see which are their main concern, for example, environmental, ecological concern, and what also they need to develop sustainability in their communities. You know, with climate change, a lot of things are happening, and they're sometimes threaten the livelihoods and how indigenous people live, their culture. So if science can help to maybe develop or understand better the nature for sustainability, that would be great. So working together with indigenous communities is the second important step to me, to have them to be involved in the UN decade.
Engagement holistically from the beginning is so important. That's founded in trust and understanding. And I think traditionally there has been, strong distrust and lack of understanding. And it seems like that narrative is changing. I'm looking forward to continuing that discussion tomorrow as well. Do any other panelists have folks to add, to have anything to add to Fanny's points? I see a question in the chat, in the Q&A function. How are the UN decade leaders and experts represented in events such as the COP26? Lisa, do you have any insight there?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So there are a couple of things. I'm not intimately involved in the planning around Canada's participation at COP26. I do know a couple of things, though, that our colleagues at the IOC are planning a few side events at COP26 to talk specifically about the ocean decade. I think that there are 3 of those planned. So these side events are a really fabulous opportunity to talk about what the ocean decade is trying to do. I think there's one related broadly to the ocean decade. There's another one that's focusing specifically on the Asia Pacific. And then there's a third talking about financing, which is very interesting. So our colleagues at the IOC are organizing those to have specific ocean decade discussions. But then there are other people in the broader ocean science community, understanding that we're talking about science as meaning sort of any kind of knowledge. Other Canadians, other ocean science community members who are participating at COP26 who also happen to be involved in some ocean decade activities. So I think that it's going to sort of come out and be a theme that runs throughout the whole discussions over the next couple of weeks.
Elliot, I hope that mostly answered your question. If not, feel free to follow up in the chat. Do any of our panelists have additional comments to add there? Doug?
Well, I was thinking, I mean, I'm also not aware of very massive involvement. I know there are some specific agendas being promoted at COP26. You know, I'm from Glasgow myself. I was sort of really hoping to have an invite, but it didn't happen. That's okay. I can live with that. But seriously, I do think our ocean community sometimes, we have organizations that bring us together. But I think one thing I'd personally like to see for the UN decade is that we get more organized than we have been, and that we find ways to more effectively raise the issues of these urgent ocean science issues in international fora like that. I think some other communities like focus specifically on biodiversity, for example, not ocean biodiversity, are more effective sometimes. So again, put that all on the shoulders of the early career researchers. I think we could, I think we could do better, you know, in general at raising these issues. But we are making progress. I don't want to be negative here. We're making progress, but I think for COP27, whatever that is, I think we could do better, and maybe Canada can take a lead in that.
I do also want to make the point that while, you know, a lot of this does revolve around early career folks kind of leveraging this work, It's not all on our shoulders. It's the responsibility of the preceding generations to help make space for us, to help get us into those conversations. We need allies on all fronts. And while maybe some folks might not be there in a decade, we all have a responsibility, right?
Absolutely. Fair enough. I was actually being a little bit facetious there, but nevertheless, you're absolutely right. Lexa, we need to create the structures which allow that to happen and the support that allows that to happen. Mm-hmm.
I think that leads to the next question really well. How can we collectively and individually make substantial differences or contributions to the decade? Jennifer or Neha, maybe one of you would like to speak to this point.
Sure, yeah, I can jump in here. I've been thinking about this one a lot, and I often think about how, as ocean scientists, we're a really closed community in many ways. It's a small community in Canada. We don't always have links to other groups. And so I think for me, a successful ocean decade would look like we're engaging everyone from Canada, not just ocean scientists, but people from every sector. And one sector I think that often gets forgotten is new Canadians and Canadians that aren't strong English speakers. Everything that we do for ocean science is in English. And so that automatically leaves out a large percentage of people around the world, but also Canadians. And you know, a lot of our new Canadians are coming from countries that have already experienced extreme climate change, and they have firsthand knowledge of what's going on. And so, yeah, the substantial difference that I would love to see is to engage a lot of those different groups, and perhaps starting to have ocean science talks in different languages. I don't know how that could happen. I guess it could easily happen with a translator, but to really reach out into those diverse communities, to me, would be a substantial contribution.
Absolutely, Jennifer. I think you've made a really important point in that we are a little bit biased in the languages that we use to communicate our work, and we definitely can do better to try to be more diverse and more inclusive for folks with different backgrounds.
Yeah, I think the English is a privilege, and I've been thinking about that more and more. I mean, unless you're coming from an English-speaking country, you know, in order to learn to speak English in many places means that you've gone to private school. And that, of course, is not realistic for a vast majority of people in the world.
Absolutely. Are there any other ways folks can think of and how we can make substantial differences or contributions to the decade?
I think Jen made a really great point just now, and I think it kind of reinforces like the scientific communication aspect that you were talking about earlier. So I think as scientists primarily here, really focusing on science communication of our research and sort of engagement with the community that we're working with is a really important thing as a scientist. And I think that's sort of a collective answer. And individually, there's lots of stuff you can participate in. I can post in the chat. The UN Ocean Decade just launched their stakeholders forum, and anyone can sign up, and it's a great resource to look at what's happening globally, different opportunities that you may be able to access and could change your trajectory of research. So I'll post that in the chat, and individually just spreading the word, you know, it's kind of a cheesy answer, but it really helps.
If I can add, and again, an agreement, but I think, you know, it gets back to that communication. If you can learn, you know, what the Ocean Decade involves and what are the opportunities can be shared to everyone, then people can, you know, by knowing what's possible, then they can just volunteer. And I think that's the thing. Collectively, there could be all sorts of coordination, but individually, you know, you've just got to make a decision. The oceans are important. The UN Decade's important, and then you make time and you find the opportunity or opportunities where you can best contribute. I think, you know, it's got to be the willingness to become involved. You know, we're all busy. We're all probably all too busy, but so what? There's some things are important. You know, make time.
Alexa, just quick. I think we need to take this decade, or hopefully less time, have a look at the inequities globally. We've discussed that a little bit about the inequities in Canada, and we're working on that. I think we have to look at the inequities of access to research funds, the way in which we do science, all across the world. I think there are obviously some parts of the world where people are struggling with tremendous ocean pressures without the resources required to address them. And some of the ways we do science need to be examined. I think the business of how we publish our results need to be examined, especially in journals that charge tens of thousands of dollars to publish a scientific paper. That's not going to be ever equitable. And the way in which we place barriers on mobility needs to be looked at for scientists, especially the massive visa issues that scientists in Africa face to go anywhere. So maybe we just have to really critically examine the global nature of the way we do ocean science, because it is a global business, more so than almost any other branch of science. And so I think there's some critical thinking we have to do of the structural impediments and barriers to equitable research across the world. And that doesn't sound easy, but I think it's really important that we're better one decade from now than we are right now.
Doug, you're making an incredible point in how we really do have a lot of work as scientists to ensure that what we're doing is equitable, and that requires an in-depth look at the systemic ways in which we perpetuate injustice, but not only within the systems that we fall under, but also within ourselves and how we move through the world. I'm really looking forward to our session coming up on Wednesday with Future Ancestor Services on anti-racism and equity in science. This is a closed session, but I do truly hope that we can share some of this knowledge with folks, because we certainly have our work cut out for us. I do see. Go ahead, Neha.
Sorry, can I just say one thing about being equitable? From speaking for the ECOP program, the global ECOP program, I know there's right now there's a lot of funding allocation that's preferentially being allocated to the regional nodes in Africa and the Southeast Islands, Pacific Islands, excuse me, which I think is a great show of, hey, we're allocating resources where they need to be, so just wanted to add that comment there.
Thank you, Neha.
Yeah, Alexa, just a comment. I wanted to piggyback on Doug's idea. I was listening to him and I said, okay, equity, I think Canada can play a great role in equity and developing partnership between North and South, what we call North and South in the UNESCO way, in the UN nation way. For example, African researchers don't always have places on cruises, scientific cruises on ships, for example. So we could maybe promote very local initiative or very targeted initiative to help people and scientists who don't have a lot of access to the cruise or to the research funds, to help them to make science and to keep going with what they want to do if we have a chance. So I just wanted to add that comment.
Absolutely. You're completely right, Fanny. We definitely do need to be making spaces, for where that work is needed, but doing it in a way that is meaningful and isn't, an act of tokenism or ornamentalism, and really making sure that what we're doing has strong integrity. And I want to follow up from a question in the chat from Kahoosh, which is actually a follow-up question to a previous point you made, Fanny. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it out loud. A follow-up from Fanny's point about working together with Indigenous communities in advancing UN Decade goals. I'm curious how Indigenous communities usually respond to such approaches. Has there been an effort already in that aspect? And what was that like?
Yeah, in terms of being involved in the UN Decade, sitting on committees, for example, I think I don't want to speak for them, but I think it's highly appreciated. The way that they have a space to be able to express what they want to express, because they was not like that in the past. All their traditional knowledge was not considered, and it's so highly valuable. It was not considered at all. So I think this having a space, having their land and knowledge at the beginning of sessions or working session, for example, it's a great step in the reconciliation process and in recognizing what they can bring to the society, to the science. So usually I think it's a good point for them. I think it's they like or they appreciate to be involved like that. For a scientific project, it doesn't have to come out from nowhere. What I mean is that you have to have good relationship and trust, and then you can move on scientific projects together. But from the beginning, starting a partnership and about a research question from the beginning of the question, it's important. It's really important, and it's appreciated also when you don't just throw the idea and then you ask the community to help. It's always better when you have discussion to try to see if it's important for them, if the question you want to address is important for them in a long-term way too.
Thank you, Fanny. I hope that answered your question, Kush. And if you have any further follow-up, we can do some back and forth in the chat. There's another question here from Sam. They are interested in learning how the UN Decade will respond or intertwine with the findings of the recent IPCC AR6 report. Can one of our panelists comment or speak to the connections and links there?
I can maybe kick us off, but I'd love to hear thoughts from others as well. I know that change and the recognition of the important role of the ocean is a key element of the Ocean Decade. And in this most recent call for programs, the IOC is explicitly seeking programs that look at that ocean climate nexus. So it is an area that's a preoccupation, priority for the Ocean Decade, and they're really putting an effort on soliciting programs that would respond to that, and then in time projects that will help to support it. So it's being embedded within those outcomes, those 7 outcomes to begin with, and as a real theme that sort of will travel throughout the whole decade, but with important quick action at the very beginning as part of this call that they just launched about 2 weeks ago.
Thank you, Lisa, for shedding some light. Do any of our panelists have any additional insight to share?
It's a great question. As you got us partially stumped. I was hoping Paul Myers would have an answer for this one.
I guess I can try to answer. I think there's a lot of discussion about how projects and things proposed for the UN Decade can answer climate type activities, and especially I think building in linkages between other programs is what's going on. Like, it just turns out by timing, the virtual international score meeting is actually the same week. And one of the things that's being discussed there is how, for example, working groups attacking questions, say climate change impacts on air-sea fluxes, climate change impacts on biodiversity. How can they build links and internet with UN Decade programs? How can major initiatives, SOLAS, GeoTraces, IMBER, etc., that have basically lots of teams working on aspects of climate change in the ocean, how to best integrate them with programs coming through the UN Decade, that you get sort of all the different ideas going together, and you really can get hopefully greater knowledge, and then more, that knowledge being then passed to groups who can then try to use them into policy to try to improve situations in the future. So I think it's still very much a space where people are learning, but there's definitely a strong goal that all the programs that are asking questions and trying to understand some of the underlying science can be linked into the UN Decade, and then linked into what, how can that knowledge be used to benefit society.
Make a great point, Paul. I think this does have to be interwoven with all of that we do. It has to be one of those values that's kind of driving us in all that we do. And not just as scientists, I think in general, as society, we all play a part here. So just being mindful of time, I am going to end the poll around getting involved, and I will share the results so folks can see. It seems like there's a fair amount of folks who'd like to join the Canadian ECOP chapter. So I do believe Neha has provided contact information so you can get in touch. I see that folks also would like to connect and collaborate with other Canadians on UN Decade activities. Liisa provided a wealth of information on opportunities and how to get involved, as well as stay informed. We're also, myself and Paul, along with a few other folks who are trying to engage in a UN Decade community of practice, we're trying to mobilize a town hall. We can drop an expression of interest. If you'd like to attend that, we can drop that link in the chat. And I think that should help fill the niche that some of you have responded to in this poll. I do want to open it up to the panelists and ask you, what are some of the best resources and engagement opportunities for people who want to get more involved, building on some of what we've talked about already?
I highly recommend checking out the forum website. Like even the previous question, like how is the Ocean Decade involved in all these climate actions? There's loads of really nicely defined climate actions on that website, and it's a great one to navigate, and also kind of serves as a networking platform as well. So I highly recommend just checking that out. And then I'll say this, but it's a kind of initiative of DFO and Lisa's team. So sorry, Liisa, I'm speaking on your behalf, but there's a really amazing conference that's happening next May, the IC's Pisces Early Career Scientist Conference. And that's a really amazing opportunity to get involved as an early career scientist and to learn more about the international ECOP community. So I'll post that in the chat as well. Sorry, Liisa, got excited.
No, that's so great. I'm glad you're excited about that. So are we.
And if I can follow up briefly on one of the comments Alexa was made, sorry, on this, in terms of making great strides, no idea yet, but making the first small footsteps, I think is important. You're trying to, through MEOPAR, create a community of practice. Again, just a subset of the entire UN Decade, sort of on the research scientist side, from early career scientists to more experienced. Not experience is a bad choice of word. Those who have been around longer and have had more, more exposure to different things. And really, what I think is we just need to find we need to set up a medium to talk more, to communicate more. How, when, whether it's Neha's group, UN Forum, DFO, etc., gets information, announces something, or someone saying, "I'm planning things. Who else can coordinate with you?" I think we need that mechanism to allow all these groups to rapidly share with all their stakeholders, all their contacts, and then back and forth to try to see who can build things, who can put things together. So I don't think we've made great strides. We've made the first stride, and we really have to put a lot more into building that, because I think if everyone knows what's going on, it's a lot easier then to get involved than if it's hard to find that information. So I think that's an important thing we need to work forward, moving forward.
Absolutely. Keeping time.
Alexa?
Absolutely. Go for it.
I just wanted to mention two things. At the Canadian level, there is the Canadian Commission for the UNESCO, which is not directly involved only in the Ocean Decade, but it's more global. And they have an ocean group working on, preparing some review and recommendations directly related to the UN Decade. So they work a lot about decolonialisms and this inequity and diversity. So I will put the link in the chat. You can check also what they do. There are a lot of resources like documents and so on. And at more international level, there is the work of the Intergovernmental Commission, Oceanographic Commission, which publishes on the Facebook a lot of news and opportunities. So I can put the link to in the chat. And I think these organizations are doing a great job for the UN Decade.
Thank you for pointing that out, Fanny. If you could share that information in the chat, I'm sure many folks will find that helpful. Lisa, I do also see a targeted question in the chat for you. And keeping timing in mind, there is one last discussion question that I would like to end with. So I'm just going to skip over some of these. So imagine we're in 2030. I want to know, how has our ocean changed and the landscape of ocean sciences changed? What's this future going to look like?
I can, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I was going to say that for one, I hope we have really strong commitments from the world community to deal with climate change. Because yeah, in my mind, the three main issues that the ocean is experiencing is warming, the loss of oxygen, and ocean acidification. And all three of those things can be dealt with or eased if we lower our greenhouse emissions.
I think also one thing that I know is on the forefront of a lot of our minds is having diversity in leadership roles. That's something that I'm really hoping to see 10 years from now.
I will second that as well. I mean, we've heard about the need to engage across broad disciplines, genders, cultures, so that I hope by 2030 we have great representation, including the ECOPs of today or those leaders tomorrow and mentoring other ECOPs. I hope that we have Indigenous partners who are also leading Ocean Decade projects as well.
I'll have a go. I'd hope that by 2030, we'd have really effective structures for international cooperation in ocean science, which we depend on so much, but that it actually gets to the point where that international cooperation is equitable amongst nations and amongst peoples in different continents. I think in addition to everything else that's been said, which is also important, but I'd really hope Canada would take a lead in pushing that forward, that this north-south barrier diminishes somewhat so that we can look after the ocean globally more effectively.
And I'm actually going to add a sort of a slightly different point because it didn't really come up much in this discussion, but I hope through the Ocean Decade, we also see a huge development in Canadians and people worldwide of ocean literacy. So Canadians, people in general understand why the ocean's important, why we care for it, and why we really have to deal with these issues. And it doesn't then seem so much, get issues, okay, academics talking about whatever, and them not, you need, a broad spectrum of people understanding all those questions, why they're important, why we have to deal with them, and the approach to deal with them. Because, I think we all, in our community, we all know the ocean's important, it's critical. But I think to deal with some of the things that people have mentioned, we do really need that, it broadly, what we know is important is broadly understood. And then that will also probably bring up a whole suite of other questions we haven't thought about because when other people are then understanding the ocean and able to ask all sorts of relevant aspects. I'm going to throw that out as another thing we need to get out of this ocean, get out of this decade, is how to communicate everything we've been talking about to the broadest suite of stakeholders possible.
Absolutely. Science communication is key to this work. I hope by 2030 that, the more scientists there are, they're also rock star science communicators, because that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and I'd like to say on that note too that scientists were not the best communicators, and even science communicators really only often speak the language of science. So bringing in other people with a different background, especially from the arts and writing, journalism, filmmaking, those sorts of backgrounds, those sorts of partnerships can really help get our messages across and tell all of the really cool stories that we're working on.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to turn to the last slide here and point out that we have a session being offered by Diversity of Nature. They are a BIPOC-led nonprofit based out of Dalhousie University, and they're focusing a session exactly on effective scientific outreach. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, the panelists, and attendees for such an enriching conversation around the UN Decade of Ocean Science. We sure have our work cut out for us. If you're interested in participating in the town hall that Paul and I briefly mentioned for advancing Canadian researcher involvement in the UN Decade, you can fill out the link in the chat, the expression of interest form that Brianne will help pop in there. And we really hope that you enjoyed the session, and we encourage you to reach out to each other using those contact cards that were provided at the start. It's a great opportunity to learn more about one another and to start forging those linkages. And we will take a break now and be back at 2 p.m. ADT for Ellen Kelsey's session on Why Hope Matters, how to find meaningful engagement in the age of eco-anxiety and climate doom. We're really looking forward to that session. Thank you all again for joining, and we'll see you later.